Here we are, pleasant afternoon. I want to look at charity work versus parliamentary legislation. I don't think most people realise there are 32,000 registered charities in this country. And there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people with the best of intentions doing voluntary work for many of these charities. Many are not for profit. Some, like some of the major religious institutions who receive billions of dollars of government grants, are for profit. So if we had the same number of people involved in political and protest action to actually change legislation, would it make the same impact as all these people giving their time to various charities which are trying to put a finger in the dike of the little Dutch boy? Because charities are not needed in a society where the legislative program looks after the interests of the people it governs. The greater the number of charities, the greater the amount of competition for a shrinking disposable dollar, the less impetus or pressure is there on state or federal governments to pass legislation to address those particular issues. Now, if we go back a few centuries, well, less than a century in this country, you find there was no social security system. You had the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And the deserving poor were those who begged and beseeched, and the undeserving poor were those who, put their finger up at the inappropriate time. So I'm not denigrating any work done by charities, because without those volunteers and without those organisations, the social and economic problems faced by an increasing number of Australians would dramatically increase. But ultimately, what charities do is put a finger in the dike. I mean, it's ridiculous that in a country as rich as Australia, we have food banks to provide food to people who can't afford to buy food in this country. It's ridiculous that we have a private charity advertising heavily for Australians to give money to them so they can put Australian kids through Australian public schools, because government legislation does not provide these essential services for these children. It's one thing to provide extras above the basic necessities. It's one thing to try to raise money for research outcomes, but even in that situation, you would think that there would be money for research outcomes. Even the many advertisements we are faced with every day, whether it's on social media, radio, television, legacy media, about sponsoring a child overseas, I mean, that issue could actually be addressed by legislation which ensures that a percentage of this country's gross national product is delivered as aid, especially to the Asia Pacific region, especially to our nearest neighbours. So it's a balancing act. Obviously, people don't like seeing people homeless on the street. They don't like seeing people beg on the street. They don't like seeing people go hungry. They don't like seeing children not having the basic necessities to access, education. And that's why they donate and continue to donate to charities. So we've got two issues. We've got the millions of volunteer hours which go into providing these basic necessities for citizens and residents in this country. And we have tens of thousands, over 30,000 organisations which do charitable work. And these are charities which receive a tax deduction for their activities. Now, obviously, there are many volunteer groups outside this particular group which are essential to provide essential services to people in this community. Now, I've spoken before about national disaster centres and how to finance them. It's ridiculous that in a country as rich as in Australia that we have to rely on volunteers like the SES and the CFA to a significant degree to provide the necessary services, especially in regional and rural Australia, to provide basic services which people in the cities take for granted. So why do we find ourselves in this situation? That one of the richest countries on the planet has to rely on charities and volunteers to provide basic necessities and basic services to an increasing number of Australians. We never have had so many billionaires, let alone multi-millionaires in this country. But the story of the last 50 years has been a story of a reduction in social mobility. It's all about the accident of birth. And that's why charities have become important. What's the point of having a social security system which cannot provide the basic necessities as far as housing is concerned? And we've spoken about public housing ad nauseum on this program. Ad nauseum. That can't provide food. That can't provide shelter. That can't provide security. It's an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in the 21st century in this country. And having to rely on private charities who need to go cap in hand to the general population to get enough income to provide those basic services is a travesty. It's not only a travesty, it is a disaster. Now, if the number of people who are now involved in charitable work or involved in political action to change legislation to provide basic necessities to an increasing number of Australians who require these basic necessities, it would be a different story. It would be a totally different story. If the tens of thousands of people who volunteer their time to do charitable work, and again I think this is a great thing, but if they devoted some of that time to political action, to change legislation, to provide services, provides goods for people who need them, then we would be in a much stronger position and we wouldn't need as many charities in this country. And more importantly, people would get the services they require. The introduction of Medicare, which was called Medibank initially, a universal health insurance scheme in 1972-73, didn't come out of thin air. It came out of political action. The fact that Medicare has been allowed to be run down by successive, mainly Liberal national parties, so that bulk billing is no longer an option for a significant number of working people, highlights what happens when you remove pressure from government to provide basic necessities. Why should we have elderly people who have spent a lifetime working for this country, in many regards on low wages, find themselves in their twilight years having to worry about things like a roof over their heads, security, personal security and food security? It's extraordinary. Why do they have to go to a private charity, whether it's church run, whether it's for profit, whether it's not for profit? Why do they need to put their hands out and go to a private charity in order to be provided with these basic necessities? I mean, we're not living in some developing nation that doesn't have the resources to feed its people. We are living on potentially the richest continent on the planet. 26 million people living on a continent. 26 million people on a resource-rich continent. Irrespective of whether you think that Australia can handle a larger population, not because of the amount of arable land, the fact is that this is an extremely rich continent, and we are an extremely rich people. But the problem isn't wealth creation. That's never been a problem. The problem is the privatisation of our national assets. The problem is allowing a shrinking minority to manipulate the political legislative agenda to suit them. Every time there's political action for an increase in taxes for the rich and powerful, what happens? All hell breaks loose, because they own the means of production, distribution, exchange and most importantly communication. What happens when a Labor leader talked about ending negative gearing? The misinformation and disinformation was so overwhelming that they lost the election, the federal election. What happens whenever there is a challenge to the status quo? The dilemma is, today, the major charities have been incorporated into the framework of the capitalist system. They are expected to make up the leeway, and they've been incorporated by the privatisation of essential services, which are then handed to these handful of rich, church-based, in the majority of cases, charities to manage responsibilities which should be managed by government. Housing is a classical example. Public housing as an issue is dead in this country, although we have a housing crisis. It's all about privatising what's left of the public housing sector and giving title to the community and social housing sector, which, whether for profit or not for profit, are privately owned organisations which cherry pick tenants. The thing about legislation, theoretically, is that everybody is equal in terms of their ability to access resources which are designated to them through legislation. We now have a ridiculous situation where there is nobody speaks publicly about what's occurred in this country, because if you are a major charity and you take on a government contract, and in many cases these contracts exceed billions of dollars over a 12-month period, part of that contract stipulates that you cannot criticise government policy. So in the scientific sphere and in the public sphere, we've seen the death of the public intellectual through the introduction of short-term contracts in universities and technical college. In the charity section, or the so-called welfare section, we've seen the privatisation, the destruction of the abilities of church leaders and community activists who are involved in charities to come out and publicly articulate the need for legislative change. I mean, you've got an option. You can put your finger in the dike, and every time there's a new hole you can put another finger in the dike. But when you run out of fingers, when you run out of 10 fingers, you still have a problem with the dike collapsing. And it's the same in regards charities and legislation to resolve social and economic issues. You can have all the charities in the world, but unless you fix the fundamental problem through legislation, those charities will never be able to address the problem. So this is an appeal to all those volunteers who've devoted hours, weeks, months, years to providing services, essential services to people that need those services because there is no legislative umbrella, to move beyond charity work, to move into political action, to goad the charities they work for to actually open their mouths and demand political change. Because every social innovation, whether it was the creation of the social welfare system after World War II, which gave the Commonwealth power to create pensions, whether it's old age or disability, blind pension, or whether it was the ability of people to access healthcare or access public housing, all that came through struggle. Charitable work is a stop-gap measure. I'm not saying to people to stop their charitable work because that would have disastrous consequences. But I'm saying to people to take political action, to form groups within these charities to highlight that the only solution to poverty, the only solution to homelessness, the only solution to adequate access to public education, the only solution to dental care is a legislative solution, because a legislative solution ensures that those with the most are taxed in a variety of ways to provide benefits for those in society who've been marginalised and exploited, because that's what it's about. It's about exploitation. Nobody in this country should be living in poverty. Nobody in this country should go hungry to bed tonight. Nobody in this country should be paying 50 to 60 to 70% of their income to keep a roof over their head. Nobody in this country should be homeless tonight. The facts are that these problems continue in our society because for far too long we have relied on charities to fill the gaps. And the issue is, as the gaps increases, as the wealth division increases, as social mobility decreases, no charity, not even 30,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 registered charities can resolve this issue. It's only through political action, forcing political parties to take on these ideas and introduce legislation in parliaments for once and for all to resolve these issues. The ball is in your court.